So we can see that a little event can cause a mass uprising. On a global scale, capitalist crises have major repercussions. More recently, in Greece, large class struggles have occurred. Later, I will speak about the experience of Syria. But it's significant to note that important class struggles happened in Europe. We can mention Spain, Portugal, Italy, and that it without mentioning Asia or America. You know, undoubtedly that last September, the most important general strike in humanity's history happened in India. So we can undoubtedly that we are experiencing a period of mass uprisings. In our organization, in the New Anti-Capitalist Party, in the Fourth International, we discuss a lot about whether the situation is revolutionary or not. So I quote Trotsky. In 1936, Trotsky said, "In the processes of history, within stable situations which are altogether non-revolutionary. Within likewise situations which are obviously revolutionary. And again, there are counter-revolutionary situations. But the most striking features of our epoch of capitalism in this decade are intermediate and transitional. Situation between the non-revolutionary and the pre-revolutionary, between the pre-revolutionary and the revolutionary or the counter-revolutionary. It is precisely this transitional stage which have a decisive importance from the point of view of political strategy. In front of the only thing capitalism imposes, misery, war, and unemployment, humanity is trying to find a positive way out. This is the relevance of the revolution. Humanity needs a revolution, and this revolution is possible, and it is getting ready. However, these uprisings, for the moment, have not won. What lessons can be learned from the Russian Revolution for today? Why did the uprisings in Arab countries, for example, didn't result in a positive government for the workers and youth? I will give 3 examples to answer this question. Tunisia, Greece, and Guyana. As you know, Tunisia was the starting point of the Arabian Revolution. In the Tunisian Revolution, youth plays a very important role. Most of the martyrs of the revolution were young. The politicization of young people has accelerated through contact with workers, who also quickly joined the mobilization. So, the UGTT, the main Tunisian trade union, was the main actor of the revolution. In many areas, sections called for general strikes. In most cities, young people met with striking workers in the trade union offices. These strikes precipitated the fall of the Ben Ali regime. Unfortunately, the policy of the trade union leadership and of the radical left did not allow the working class to establish its own power. In 2011, the Islamist party of Ennahda won the elections. In front of this party, the radical left, including Workers' Party and the Workers' Left League, the section of the Fourth International, this party made an alliance with the bourgeois party Nida Tunis, in which many of the leaders of the old regime were a part of. The UGTT proposed a national dialogue with the employers. So, the working class renounced their political independence. All leaders, employers, imperialists were able to against the power they had almost lost. Now let us talk about Greece. Since 2010, big struggles have occurred in Greece. Against the Troika, the union between the IMF, the European Union, and the European Bank. Against this Troika, workers mobilized in strong general strikes. But the policy of the labor leadership scattered the days of the mobilizations. Furthermore, the Communist Party fostered a sectarian policy. Its trade unions called for separate protests from the rest of the workers. So, the Troika was able to impose its policy, even if the Socialist Party, the PASOK, that applied the previous austerity, disappeared electorally. In place of the Socialist Party, Syriza, a reformist party of the radical left, came to power in the 2015 elections. But this party was reformist. So, it did not allow working class to have an independent policy. On the contrary, they claimed to be able to negotiate with the other European regimes within the institutions. They refused to mobilize the working class and to break with the European Union and all the Greek bourgeoisie. Of course, Tsipras was unable to negotiate with all these bandits. So the Syriza government had to apply an even more violent policy than their predecessors. So we have a left radical government which applies very violent measures against the workers. My third example is Guyana. Guyana is a French colony in South America next to Brazil. In last April, a general strike occurred. The mobilization was very strong. The majority of the population demonstrated in the streets. High school students blocked their schools. The Ariane rocket could not take off for a month. But the leadership of the mobilization was the petty bourgeoisie, the employers, the MEDEF Guyane, and the reactionary group of the 500 Brothers. This group demanded the end of immigration and the fight against insecurity. The leader of the 500 Brothers said, "A good thief is a dead thief." Very nice. So the labor union tried to impose labor demands, but the French government relied on the local employers to satisfy the demands and to fight the working class. The labor unions were unable to take the lead in the mobilization. The common point of these three examples is the absence of an independent policy of the working class. The most important lesson of the Russian Revolution is this: the working class needs an independent policy. This class must lead the mobilization. In March 1917, the mass revolutionary mobilization overthrew the Tsar. In place of the monarchy, a provisional government was born, but this government was a bourgeois government. It continued the war, defended the great landlords and the employers. Lenin, in his April thesis, explains the revolutionaries must fight against the provisional government and hand the power to the Soviet, that is, the working class. He wrote, "No support for the provisional government. The authenticity of all its promises should be made clear, particularly of those relating to the renunciation of annexations. Exposure in place of the impermissible, illusion-building demands that this government, a government of capitalists, should cease to be an imperialist government." And he wrote too, "The masses must be made to see that the Soviets of workers' deputies are the only possible form of revolutionary government, and that therefore our task is, as long as this government yields to the influence of the bourgeoisie, to present a patient, systematic, and persistent explanation of the error of the tactics, an explanation especially adapted to the practical needs of the masses." So, the main lesson of the Russian Revolution is the working class must take the power. But for this, workers need a revolutionary party, which is able to raise the question of the power at the good moment. The Bolshevik Party played a decisive role in the October Revolution. Right now, we are weak, we are small. We had few activists in key industrial sectors. The power relationship around us right now is negative. The situation is negative.
5 minutes.
Many people say this in the extreme left. But in 1904, Bolshevik Party was very small. The repression was very strong in Russia. And in the beginning of 1917, the revolutionary socialists and the Mensheviks, that is, reformists, they were hegemonic in the working class. However, Bolshevik plays an important role because they educated militants.
Right.
So, our most important task today is building a revolutionary party. This party can't be constructed any other way than by intervening directly in workers' struggles. So, we are convinced of the need of establish ourselves in the working class. We try to build trade unions with radical militants. We try to use all the moments of confrontation between capitalists and workers to educate activists. What we do isn't just to take all political initiatives. We try to educate activists because we expect they will form a real party in the decisive moment. The current slogans are decisive because if we play a role in those, we can be ready in the near future. For me, this is the relevance of the revolution. We must build a revolutionary party.
Yeah.
Vive la commune!
Comrade Mackler.
Well, I must say Barry made a big splash. And I'm standing on it, but that's okay. I appreciated the comments of the talks of both comrades.
Mike.
So I'm going to give, summarize the main points. Why are we celebrating the Russian Revolution? What was its relevance? In my opinion, it was the greatest event in the history of the world. The Russian Revolution took place in the largest country in the world that occupied 1/6 of the land surface of the earth and gave that land to the peasants. No other revolution in history has had such a land reform. It was the only revolution that ended an empire, the Tsarist Empire, and gave all of the oppressed nations in the, quote, prison house of nationalities the right to self-determination, including separation. It was the only revolution on earth where the revolutionaries withdrew from the front, fraternized with the, quote, enemy, drank vodka with them, and urged them to turn on their own bourgeoisie as the soldiers returned and took this imperialist war and changed it into a civil war and ended capitalism. We stand on the traditions and the lessons of the Russian Revolution. The debate began in 1901. What kind of party shall we build? Said the delegates to the Congress of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, which was the name of the Social Democratic Party in Russia, the only party. A minority, led by Lenin, said we need a disciplined combat party prepared to challenge capitalism and take power in the name of the working class and its allies. The Mensheviks said, well, we agree, but all this discipline and regular meetings, professional cadre, that's a little too much, it's too severe, too much discipline. And there was a split over the nature of the party, with initially Lenin being a minority for the first few months, and then he won a majority of the party. And people got tired of saying, I remember the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, majority and the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party minority. So they took the Russian word Bolshevik, which means men of the majority. Today it would be men and women of the majority. And Menshevik, which means
Minority.
men of the minority. And that split lasted to the day of the revolution. One wanted to build a combat party to take power. The other essentially wanted a reformist party to ally with capitalism. In 1905, there was another revolution. And a young man named Trotsky happened to wander into St. Petersburg when the working class, after it was the Tsar imposed massive austerity in order to pay for the loss of Russia in the Russian-Japanese War of 1905, and the workers revolted and organized a massive general strike in the major city. And young Trotsky, an articulate spokesperson who had been the harshest critic of Lenin, became the leader of the St. Petersburg Soviet, and 12 years later became the leader of the St. Petersburg Soviet early on. Trotsky said, if I made one mistake in my life, or the worst mistake I've ever made, is the virulent attacks I made on Lenin regarding what kind of party we needed. Trotsky came over to Lenin in 1917 and said, we need a disciplined combat party aimed at taking power. And the polemics were worse than you could ever imagine. He called Lenin every name in the book from dictator, bureaucrat on down. And he made some enemies among the old Bolsheviks, which caused problems later on. So 1905, the Soviets were, as Barry said, limited to the major cities. They were generalized in 1917. They were the natural form of working class organization. They were a reflection of the government of the future, a government representing the majority of workers, peasants, and soldiers. They, the peasants, decided what to do with the land. The Bolsheviks simply said, the land is yours, we nationalize it, take it away from the Tsar, the aristocracy, and the capitalist class, and you and the peasant Soviets distribute it as you see fit. In 1917, there were two revolutions. Lenin was literally rowing a boat on a Swiss lake at the time of the revolution, giving speeches to university students explaining that he was not going to live to see the socialist revolution. That was the job of the youth to come. And a month later, he headed towards Russia to lead the socialist revolution. Revolutions are not predictable, but when they come, you'll know it.
Yeah.
And every revolutionary headed back to Russia. Trotsky was editing a Russian language magazine in New York City. They were exiled, as was the central leadership of the party. We always argue program. When you hear someone say, well, what's the difference between your group and A, B, C, D, E, F, G? Why can't you all get together? And when we say program, they turn a deaf ear to us. But program was decisive. Who gets the land? The Bolsheviks had the wrong program to start with. They said, well, under socialism, we want to get rid of these tiny farms with oxen. We want to use modern technology, qualitatively increase production. If we apply science to the land, we want to collectivize all the land, nationalize it. And people said, you think you're going to win the peasants to that program? They've been fighting for the land all their goddamn lives, and you're telling they're going to be working on a collective farm? And the Bolsheviks changed their program. That was the basis of winning the peasants to it. And this was not just a theoretical debate. The Bolsheviks had sent their comrades to fight in the war in order to fraternize and win over the soldiers, which they did, but they also said to the Russian peasants, why are you fighting your fellow workers who are also peasants in the German and other armies? You should be home taking the land. The Tsar is gone. And they left in mass, and the Russian army disintegrated. So the land was key. Who controls the wealth of the nation? The factories was key. What's your, by the way, the Mensheviks and all the reformists said, well, I'm for giving some concessions to the peasants, but after all, we're capitalists and we own the land. So why should we give it to the peasants? No self-respecting capitalist class in history has ever turned over its property to the oppressed, but the Bolsheviks had no interest as opposed to the other currents. What about the oppressed nationalities? We can't just give them their freedom. Why not, said the Bolsheviks, and Lenin campaigned against every vestige of chauvinism. Our position on black liberation today came from the Russian Revolution. The right of the oppressed nations to self-determination, including separation if they want. The national question is an inherent, integral part of the class question. The Bolsheviks taught us that lesson. They would not tolerate any form of discrimination against oppressed nationalities. And how did they win them over? They said, you're free. And then they fought for the revolution. How did they win over the peasants? They gave them the land. And then they fought for the revolution. They turned their program into practice. Their program was the only program capable of winning the oppressed. What about imperialist war? The Russians were dying like flies. They were outgunned. One representative said that the Russian army was a figment of your imagination. The program of the Bolsheviks was, workers of the world unite, not kill each other for imperialist plunder and division of the world. So they advocated an end to the war. That was their program, and that's the reason they won the majority. Every programmatic issue that the Bolsheviks put forward was critical to taking power. Speaking of taking power, 2 weeks before the date that they were going to take power, the Bolshevik Central Committee met. And Lenin said, I have a motion that we take power in 2 weeks. Everybody said, you must be kidding. I mean, there's a lot of danger. You take power and you lose, they kick your ass and kill you. If you take power and call a revolution, what happens if nobody comes? What happens if you call a revolution and Kerensky brings the entire white army down on you and crushes? You don't really think you can do it, do you? So they needed a maniac to lead it, and they picked Trotsky. He was the head of the Soviet Military Revolutionary Committee, a relatively small committee. He was a leader of the Soviet, and they said, that guy, he's a disciplined comrade. And they gave him 2 weeks. Stalin, Kamenev, and Zinoviev on the Central Committee, they were against it. They were panicked. They published in their own newspaper the details of the Bolsheviks taking power before they took power. Lenin called for their expulsion from the party. They were not disciplined comrades. But Trotsky said, we'll take power. And he guaranteed he'd do it in a day. He did it in 2 days. But how did they do it? Barry said only 12 people died. You gotta ask why? In taking power, the 1/6 of the land surface of the planet, 12 people died. That's in St. Petersburg. There were some battles in Moscow. The government was in the Winter Palace. So Trotsky ordered the soldiers that had come over to the revolution, they went over the entire Petrograd workers, soldiers, ordered them to fire from the river from the Aurora onto the Winter Palace. Then they'd surrender. And the workers were afraid to fire. They fucked up. You were ordered to fire, and they didn't. They were ordered again, and this time they fired blanks. And they gave up on that plot. And someone says, let's just charge. No, they infiltrated through all kinds of entrances into this massive castle, which made this building look like a dwarf building. And they fraternized with the soldiers, saying, look, if you guys want to get out of here, we're taking over, you can have a free pass out. And all the soldiers left, except some officers. Then Anton Ovasenko was ordered, you charge. He charged in to the Winter Palace, broke down the doors, and the guy was astonished. And the first thing he said, who knows the first thing he said?
Don't drink the wine.
No, they did. That was the second thing. The first thing he says, comrades, don't destroy the tapestries. They were these huge tapestries from floor to ceiling. Leave them alone. And they marched up. I was with them. personally, about 50 years later, they marched up this marble staircase, stormed into the meeting of the government, and they said, in the name of the Soviets, of the All-Russian Congress of Deputies, Russians, and soldiers, comrades, you're under arrest. And that was it. And then Lenin and his wife, Krupskaya, and Trotsky's wife, sat and went to sleep on the floor of the Winter Palace. Marble floor. I was there. And they said, well, what are we going to do? And they said, we're going to carry out the revolution. So they asked, Lenin and Trotsky asked him, you're a good writer, draft up a resolution giving all the land to the peasants and bring it to the Soviets next morning. And draft up a resolution freeing the nationalities and give it to the Soviets the next morning. The Soviets were meeting of thousands of delegates, and they passed it unanimously. There was no debate. That was the promise of the revolution. You bring us to power, we carry out our program. Not eventually, not patiently, but immediately. And they told the peasants, you take the land. In most of the cases, many of the cases, the peasants had already taken the land. As the Tsar was gone and the aristocracy was gone. What about how they organized this? Until the day of the revolution, every formulation of the Bolsheviks was defensive. They said, we're not saying we're going to take power. We're just saying we're defending the Soviets. We're defending the Soviets against the Kerensky threats to dissolve the Soviets. We're defending the Soviets against the foreign armies. We're defending the Soviets in the name of the people of Russia. Defensive formulations. Comrades, defend your land. Fight for the land. There was dual power already on the day of the revolution. There was a government that had diminishing authorities, which finally went to nothing, and there was a Soviet power, which had representatives meeting almost daily everywhere in the entire country. The Soviets would say to the general, we had a vote and we decided we're going home. At the front. And the general said, well, that's desertion. You can't do that. We'll execute you. And they shot the general. A lot of generals lost their lives, and officers. They just got shot on the spot, and tens of thousands of soldiers went home and took the land. So they didn't run around saying revolution now. They said defend the gains of the revolution. Defend your democratic rights. And when the Bolsheviks won a majority of the Soviets, they still said defend the Soviets. Because Kerensky fled and said he was going to bring back the army to challenge the power of the Soviets. So they took power on day one, and they issued all these decrees and carried them out. The bourgeoisie didn't know what to do. They had the right to publish their newspaper, and they denounced these coup makers. They said they'd be gone in a day or two. Shame on you. And they marched in their finery, and they sat in the cafes of the main streets, and they marched down Nevsky Prospect to go to the Soviets and say, you naughty boys ought to stop this. And they just laughed at them because they had no repressive apparatus left. There was no army. The army went over to the people. The army was integrated into the people because of the program of the revolutionaries. So taking power is a bit of an art. You got to know when the moment is right. If you miss that moment, the enemy will regroup. And everybody feared that. That's why Kamenev and Zinoviev said, you kidding, make a revolution, you can get your ass shot off here. That's a risk that you take. But if they didn't take that risk, that moment would likely have passed. They knew all the problems that Barry mentioned. They knew that a revolution in one of the most backward of the capitalist countries could not survive on its own and needed to spread. That was an aspect of the theory of permanent revolution. Revolution cannot be in one country. It has to be international.
Yes.
So, and you can't make a revolution unless you win over the majority and the army. And the army, the young soldiers in the army. And they won them over too. They issued decree after decree, but they carried them out instantly. They said women have the right to abortion, women have the right to divorce instantly, women have the right to child care, and they carried it out. There was so much democracy, you couldn't believe it. If people were traveling on a train, they'd establish a train for the Soviet, a Soviet for the train. And the Soviets said, okay, who's going to clean the windows of the train? Who's going to stoke the fire of the train? Who's going to put the pole in the locomotive? When should we stop? Who's going to relieve the engineer? They decided everything democratically. Remember this, that socialist revolution is the empowerment and the rule of the working class, not the party. The Bolsheviks sought to set up a multi-party government of Soviet parties, workers' parties, not capitalist parties. And initially, they had the left Mensheviks and the left SRs, social revolutionaries, in a joint government. And some of them said, the Mensheviks said, well, we'll join the government all right, but not if the Bolsheviks are leading it, just because they led the revolution against them. This revolution set the example and attracted the greatest fighters everywhere in the world, and the building of democratic fighting, class struggle, revolutionary parties of the oppressed everywhere in the world, including the United States. We had the Palmer raids in the United States where the Attorney General arrested 5,000 communists because they thought those communists were going to do in the United States what the Bolsheviks did in Russia. And they launched a massive repression. For 5 years, between 1917 and 1920, am I out of time yet?
No, you got 5 minutes, it's just going to 10.
Great, thanks. For 5 years, they introduced, under the most unusual circumstances, the most massive series of reforms ever seen in all humanity. Did they ban religion? No. Did they ban free speech? No. Did they have a government of the working class whose elected representatives from every factory and workplace were subject to immediate recall? Immediate recall. And they received the wages of a skilled worker in their trade. It was a workers' government, not a Stalinist government, which it became later. And then they withdrew from the imperialist war, and they allowed German imperialism to occupy vast swaths of Russia, including the Ukraine, the breadbasket of the nation, rather than sacrifice more tens of thousands of Russian soldiers at the troop. They kept their promise, even though, and they said, we will get that land back by winning over the German workers, not by sacrificing more and continuing an imperialist war to divide the world. And then they prepared for the counter-revolution from imperialism. And they made Trotsky, who studied Clausewitz on war in books, but didn't have any military experience. They needed a nutcase to defend against the entire world, which invaded. 17 nations invaded Russia on both sides of the imperialist war. The United States invaded in Siberia. And the Germans invaded, the French invaded, the Czechs invaded. They fought the entire goddamn world. This poor nation that didn't have an army to fight in World War I, and they won. Why did they win? How could Trotsky have formed an army of 10 million people in the midst of starvation, famine, poverty? Why did they fight? Because it was their revolution. That's the only kind of revolution people will defend with their lives. And the result was a victory. The Red Army defeated the entire world. I will say that the echoes of that victory were in World War II, where all of the European bourgeoisie surrendered to Hitler, except the Russians, because the memory of the Russian Revolution is maintained in their consciousness. They lost 27 million people in World War II, more than the entire world combined, but they didn't give up. They didn't give up. Because the memory of that revolution still was with them despite the Stalinization of that country. So you ask, why Stalin? How did he come to power? He came to power under conditions of horror created by the imperialist intervention. They thought they could bring in every damn army in the world, including the Tsarist army, and restore the Tsar, but they couldn't, because every peasant fought for their land, every oppressed nationality fought for their freedom, every woman fought for their rights, every worker fought for the right to control the factories, to collectively own society and build a planned economy in the interest of all humanity. And they expressed this in the arts, in culture, in music. The finest performers, entertainers, cultural leaders came to Russia because it was free. Free to every form of art, from abstract art, as opposed to Stalin's socialist realism, to Dadaism, to every conceivable expression of human consciousness in the field of art. They won over the great musicians of the Soviet Union and the world. So these are the lessons for us.
1 minute.
And I'll summarize them in 1 minute. One, you can't make a revolution without a disciplined party. I don't advocate revolutionary parties that function with democratic centralist norms. Majority decisions, full democracy, and then you carry out the decision to test it in life. An idea has no reality unless it meets the test of life, as in science. You come up with a hypothesis, you design an experiment to test it, and if it doesn't work, you go back to square one. I don't advocate a disciplined Leninist party for anyone except if you want to change the world. If you want to challenge capitalism. If you don't, you can form a pussycat party and talk all you want. But if you want to take power, you got to be serious. And for this party to defeat the entire world, and the ruling class, and the Tsarist army, they were a serious army. Second, program. Anytime someone says, why can't you socialists get along? You all sound alike. We don't sound alike. None of them are for class independence. In the United States, the left supported everything from Hillary Clinton to Bernie Sanders to the Green Party, which is all reform of capitalism, because they had no confidence they could take power. The entire being of the Bolshevik Party is predicated on the idea that they can take power and transform society. They are filled with the greatest aspirations for humanity, for a better world. And you can't create one by reforming capitalism. And I'll close on this. Every single horror of the capitalist system today, the existential threat of nuclear war, of global warming, fossil fuel-induced global warming, of racism, of endless wars everywhere. The United States has 1,100 military bases engaged in 7 simultaneous real wars, plus covert wars, drone wars, overt wars, special operation wars, poverty, sexism, homophobia. All of these evils are inherent, ingrained in, and necessary for the existence of capitalism. If you want to end them, you have to make a socialist revolution. And if you want to make a socialist revolution, the starting point is to understand and apply the central lessons of the Russian Revolution.
Yeah, right. Okay, comrades, it's now your turn. We're going to turn it over to you.